So the Middle East crisis isn't over. The economic war is heating up and we have to talk about it. By now, we kind of know that the Iranians are laying low. They made a lot of threats, but nothing came of it. But now the United States is poking the bear again, and I find this really bizarre and dangerous. Just a few days ago, the US lifted sanctions on Iran, allowing them to access $10 billion in Iraqi payments. Iran could transfer that money out and use it. And we kind of know why they did it, right? The US is trying to calm the situation in the Middle East, so they threw Iran a bone. Take the money and just be quiet. But now Joe Biden, he's doing a U-turn. He's now going after Iran's oil revenues, which is a very dangerous move. It threatens to destabilize the region. There's 101 things that could go horribly wrong with this. We have Biden's enforcer about to bring down the hammer on Iran's oil industry. In our lead story today, Biden advisor says sanctions will bring down Iran oil exports. And if you look into his cold eyes, you can tell that he means business. We are going to enforce those sanctions. Those numbers will come down. The US is moving to tighten the oil sanctions on Iran, and this could include everything from dollar sanctions, confiscating Iranian cargo, or even oil price caps. Now, this is a really big deal because Iran exports a ton of oil to the markets. Since January this year, Iran's crude exports have flown up. That alone hit over 1.5 million barrels a day. At today's prices, that's over $100 million a day or $37 billion a year, even with all the discounts thrown in. So just imagine the amount of chaos this will do to Iranian revenues if America does the unthinkable. Oil accounts for over 20% of Iran's GDP. 40% of government budget comes from oil revenues alone. So tightening the sanctions can indeed cripple Iran's economy. It will also render their vast oil reserves useless. Iran has the third biggest proven reserves in the world, well over 200 billion barrels under the ground. That's more than Canada and just under Saudi Arabia. But it's kind of useless if you can't transport the oil out, right? Oil sanctions can cripple Iran for decades. And I think Iran's Raisi will be watching this very carefully. There's a tipping point because the $10 billion from Iraq is nothing compared to Iran's oil industry getting shut down. The United States is playing a very dangerous game. Iran might be staying silent now, but if their money from oil and gas gets cut away, they could just lash out, and they might lash out really badly. They still have proxies in a region they could mobilize. Tens of thousands across Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen are all under the Iranian payroll. Iran going broke means they won't have money as well, and that alone could force an escalation. So we are in a very delicate situation in the Middle East. The waters, they look really calm, but the undercurrents are still extremely strong. Now, why is America making this move? It's likely a combination of political pressure and the end goal of containing Iran. It's the Russian strategy of economic sanctions all over again, but on a smaller scale. Let's focus on the politics side. The Republicans are hammering Biden on releasing the $10 billion. Ron DeSantis is calling it reckless, dangerous, and a complete wreckage. Just go to Twitter and you'll see the number of senators slamming Biden is stacking up. Then you have the former US Defense Secretary saying that defeating Hamas means dealing with Iran once and for all. Mark Esper is telling Biden to cut off the supply of arms and money, and that obviously means Iran's oil industry. The amount of pressure building for Biden to tighten the screws is really insane. But the Iranians are also making moves that are freaking the US out. They might be using the $10 billion to advance their nuclear program. I think it's an open secret that Iran is moving towards nuclear weapons and the US doesn't want them to. According to the Atomic Energy Agency, Iran now has uranium enriched up to 60% purity, close to weapons grade, for 3 atomic bombs. 90% is weapons grade, so the Iranians aren't that far off. It's a combination of all these reasons that's making Biden turn up the oil sanctions. He wants to cut away Iran's revenues and contain them. But here's the big question, right? Will the Iranians take it lying down? They could always retaliate and they have the perfect reason to do so now. The only way to defuse the Iranian threat, or at least take away any legitimate reason they have, is a ceasefire on Gaza. But neither the US nor Israel wants that. And the longer that eludes the region, the more dangerous the situation is becoming. However, oil sanctions don't just impact Iran, it impacts their biggest buyer of oil, which is China. Beijing is buying a ton of it, and any disruption is going to piss them off. China takes in over 90% of Iran's oil exports. Iran is as good as China's exclusive supplier, and they're selling this oil at huge discounts too. It's not just the volume that's reaching the moon, the cost savings are enormous as well. Iran is giving China over $15 a barrel off the market price, and this is why China doesn't have an energy inflation problem like Europe or Japan. China's imports from Iran have exploded to over a million barrels a day. That's $5.4 billion of savings alone from Iran. Is China going to roll over and give that up to enforce US sanctions? Why do you think Biden and Blinken kept pushing China to corner the Iranians? Because they know Beijing is their lifeline for oil exports. If the US goes ahead with this and starts imposing sanctions on Iranian oil, this will affect relations with China. Confiscating Iranian cargo is as good as confiscating China's cargo. And the only way I see this happening is if the US impose a price cap on Iranian oil but allowed China to continue buying. But it will mean the US is helping to grow China's economy, their biggest competitor. So they are in a big quagmire. These sanctions are going to be a complete mess, and if Biden miscalculates, this could drag Iran back into the fray. They might even rile up the Houthis and Hezbollah as well. But even without this happening, the Middle East is getting worse. And no, the latest bombshell isn't from Saudi Arabia. It isn't from Iran either. Check this out. It's actually from Israel's neighbor, the Kingdom of Jordan. Now, this is a very big deal because Jordan is an ally of the United States. They have very close relations with the US, but they can't take the chaos any further as well. Jordan has essentially given Israel a middle finger. In a stunning report, Jordan says it won't sign the energy and water exchange deal with Israel. This is a big move by the kingdom. It's an economic bombshell that's going to wake up the Middle East. Jordan has taken action which could trigger other nations to do the same. Listen to this rebuke. We will not sign this agreement any longer. Can you imagine a Jordanian minister sitting next to an Israeli minister to sign a water and electricity agreement? Understand what's happening right now. The Arab states doesn't want to expand the conflict, but neither can they stay completely silent about Gaza. So the pressure cooker is building and Jordan has taken the first step. Now the water for energy deal is simple, but it's vital for both countries and it involves the UAE as well. It's called the Green Blue Deal, but it's now 6 feet under. According to the deal, the UAE will build a solar plant in Jordan and supply Israel with electricity generated from solar power. Up to 600 megawatts of power will be exchanged for 200 million cubic meters of drinking water. Because of the war and what's going on in Gaza, even Jordan can't take it anymore. Now, this deal means a lot to the kingdom because they are extremely water scarce. UNICEF puts the threshold for absolute water scarcity at 500 cubic meters per person. Jordan is at 100. That's 5 times lower than the limit. So they are taking an economic and social hit as well. Now, this deal going away affects Israel's energy dependence as well. They have to rely more on fossil fuels like oil and gas for their power generation, but it kind of affects Jordan more. Jordan is sacrificing their economy to make a point, and I think that's quite significant. It won't be meaningful enough to stop the war, but it's symbolic. It's a sign that the Middle East and the Arab world might be reaching a breaking point. There could be more deals broken and oil might actually be weaponized if things break down further. Take a look at the countries that are reconsidering ties with Israel. We have Bahrain, Jordan, and Turkey, amongst others, that have pulled out their ambassadors. Even South Africa, a BRICS nation, has completely cut off all diplomatic ties. And this tells us how the war is effectively isolating Israel one country at a time. And because Israel is a US ally, it is also a reflection on Joe Biden as well. The longer the war drags on, US influence will continue to drain away. It's also going to be hard for many Arab countries to completely restore diplomatic ties with Israel even after the dust settles, right? So don't be surprised when the Chinese they come in and they settle the water scarcity problem for the Jordanians, right? At this point, it's going to be near impossible to revive the water for energy deal unless a ceasefire happens quickly, which I don't think it will happen. China might actually start building more desalination plants over there. But speaking of economic revenge, let's talk about the next set of Western sanctions on Russia once again. The G7 is now moving on from dollars and oil to Russian diamonds, and this is basically an admission of defeat that the current sanctions regime isn't working as well as they thought. However, a Russian diamond ban isn't easy and most probably will fail. The diamond trade is very opaque with every diamond going through dozens of hands before it reaches the end user, right? Ends up on a wedding ring or something like that. This isn't going to end well. From the FT, The Eurozone is going to move ahead with a Russian diamond ban next week. They have managed to clear the hurdles with big importers and diamond districts in the world, including Belgium. Here's why the G7 is just so confident with this. They account for 70% of the consumer market for polished diamonds, so they're going to shut down the biggest transaction window for diamonds for Russia. In theory, on paper, this should cripple the Russian diamond industry. Russia is the world's largest producer of rough diamonds, accounting for 30% of global supply. There's a huge amount of supply worth $4 billion a year that could get cut away from the markets. Because 80% of rough diamonds are traded through Antwerp, the G7 believes they can get away with it. They're also going to target the import, purchase, and transfer of Russian diamonds through third parties. So countries like India and Dubai will be affected as well. They process a lot of diamonds from Russia, and if the ban goes through, that's it for those industries. Imagine you're an Indian dealer, right? Your cost of sourcing diamonds is going to rise because 30% of global supply is now gone. But if you don't comply, you might get blacklisted or worse, sanctioned by the West. In a story from Reuters, India is asking the United States to release funds over suspected Russian diamond link. The amount is worth $26 million. The money was frozen during a transfer to buy the rough diamonds. Because of US sanctions, the banks had to halt the transactions. So yes, dealers going forward could be afraid to touch Putin's diamonds. Now you might think this is a smart move, but there are two big problems with this. You can't cut Russian diamonds out of the supply chain completely. Traceability is a very big issue, and even if that's solved, the diamonds will still end up somewhere. Let's say we take away the G7 countries, India and the UAE, there are still outlets for the diamonds to flow to. Hong Kong and China combined account for over $24 billion of diamond imports worldwide. That's 6 times the demand of what Russia can supply. What the sanctions would do is to help build China's diamond industry. Russian diamonds will be rerouted towards Beijing at lower prices. And we know the Chinese loves themselves a good discount. Here's the kicker. China's local demand for diamonds isn't too shabby either. In 2022, the market hit $8.8 billion. It's the second largest diamond jewelry market just below the United States. And what I suspect is after the sanctions, China will become a bigger hub for the industry. If Russian diamonds flow exclusively to China, that brings down their input costs, so profits are gonna rise. And we could see even traditional diamond districts like Antwerp and even Surat lose customers to China. All this does is to extend and even complicate the global supply chain further. Now, I'm sure this will reduce Russia's diamond revenues, but it will reshuffle the global diamond industry in a very big way. Besides, diamonds is just a drop in the ocean of Russian revenues. It's less than 5% of their total crude oil sales. Even if Russian diamonds totally disappear from the face of the world, it won't make a big difference. Their oil sales are still going strong. The world needs oil to survive. Diamonds are not an essential commodity. And what we are seeing is a big economic shift in the world. All the conflicts in the world, the Middle East crisis and the Ukraine war, they're just changing the entire global economy. Because of the Israel war, we are going to see more countries in the Persian Gulf shift closer and closer towards the global south, shift closer towards BRICS. Remember Saudi Arabia, Iran, and UAE's admission to the bloc in 2024? It's almost guaranteed at this point that they'll accept the invitation. They have most certainly gone weary of the West. And I won't be surprised if China eventually gets a military base in Oman once the dust settles. I think the Middle East knows it's better to have two world powers competing than one single superpower dominating the region. But there's an even bigger worry brewing. The market is bracing for yet another oil cut from OPEC. There are, in fact, very big reasons that could prompt a further slash in production that we can't ignore. OPEC Plus weighs further oil production cuts as anger mounts over Gaza. Saudi Arabia is preparing to prolong reductions into spring as prices have dropped down under $80 a barrel. JP Morgan believes a production cut could be coming simply because of oil revenues falling, right? But a bigger reason could be the war in Gaza as well that's inflaming the region. An additional OPEC cut of 1 million barrels a day could be on the table. Members like Kuwait, Algeria, and Iran aren't happy about the conflict. There's a lot of pressure for them to act. Remember, they can't embargo Israel. It's not practical. There are two US aircraft carriers on the side, so the only option left is to cut production. If a ceasefire doesn't happen and more bad news comes out of Gaza, OPEC could very well slash production in a response. So we have to hang tight here. The crisis in the Middle East is far from over. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Will America cut away Iranian oil? And will OPEC respond with more production cuts soon? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.